They told J.D. Vance to leave, thinking he would be angry, but his response left the entire diner in a state of stunned silence. The incident occurred when J.D. Vance drove into the parking lot of Maggie's Haven, a peaceful little corner nestled by a tree-lined road on the outskirts of Fairhope, Alabama. This diner, like an old gym weathered through many seasons of sun and rain, featured a faded white wooden sign gently swaying in the soft afternoon breeze. Each time the door opened, a sweet aroma of toasted bread with melted cheese blended with the scent of freshly roasted coffee, as if offering a gentle invitation. A roadside flower seller that morning had enthusiastically recommended this place, praising the irresistibly crispy fried chicken and homemade mashed potatoes to such an extent that J.D. could not resist stopping by. He was utterly exhausted. After a long day filled with tense meetings, obligatory handshakes, and a series of dry speeches, all he longed for was a quiet meal before driving home under the gradually descending sunset. The chime of a wind bell hanging on the door softly rang as he stepped inside, its clear sound like a welcoming note. The small diner was warm and inviting, with an indescribable charm that was at least fleetingly apparent at first glance. It was the kind of place where familiar patrons usually sat at the gleaming wooden tables each evening, where the wall near the cash register was adorned with old photographs preserving decades of smiling faces. The air carried a hint of the rich aroma of fried food and strong coffee, while gentle murmurs of conversation flowed like a small stream through the room. J.D.'s eyes met those of the server standing behind the counter. Her name was Clara, as indicated on the small sign pinned to her modest uniform. She had been smiling brightly when, all of a sudden, she froze upon recognizing him. It was only a fleeting moment, but J.D. perceptively noted a hint of hesitation in her eyes, as though she had been about to do something but then wavered. The smile on her lips faded into a more reserved expression. He casually glanced around. A customer, pausing from savoring his sandwich, leaned over to whisper something to his table companion, his voice as soft as a passing breeze. A woman in a gentle knit sweater, perhaps Mrs. Ellen, set her coffee cup down on the table with a light clink that was enough to draw attention. Mrs. Ellen's eyes narrowed slightly before shifting toward the window bathed in the glow of the late afternoon. J.D. was not one to be easily deceived. He was accustomed to entering rooms where a warm welcome was not always guaranteed. But here, in such a modest diner, why would that be? Clara slowly approached, her hand casually adjusting the disheveled lock of hair by her ear with a gentle motion. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice even yet tinged with caution. "Would you like to dine in or take out?" J.D. offered a tired but sincere smile. "I'd like to sit, if you don't mind." She remained silent for a moment, longer than necessary for such a simple question. "Actually," she said, turning her head slightly toward the kitchen before returning to face him, "I need to check on something. Please wait just a moment." "Just a minute," he replied. She gracefully stepped through the double doors leading to the kitchen, leaving J.D. standing in the narrow corridor, while a few more discreet glances were cast his way. A man sitting at the counter, Mr. Henry, with his weathered appearance, slowly shifted in his chair, his movements deliberate as if lost in thought. Someone murmured something, their voice so low it blended with the air. Something felt off, he sensed. Time itself seemed to slow. From behind the kitchen, vague voices emerged, sometimes near, sometimes distant, too indistinct to decipher. J.D. exhaled softly, his shoulders relaxing slightly to dispel the tension. He had no intention of causing a disturbance, nor did he wish to jump to conclusions. Perhaps it was an internal policy. Perhaps they were simply busy. Perhaps Clara returned. This time she no longer exhibited any hesitation. Her face now radiated a clear decisiveness. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said, her voice firm yet still polite, "but tonight we are unable to serve you." Yet the way she uttered those words, and the manner in which the entire space seemed to freeze around each syllable, indicated that this was not merely an operational matter. It carried a deeper, more personal significance. For a brief moment, J.D. Vance said nothing. The refusal hung between them, heavy as an invisible stone, requiring no further explanation. The diner fell silent, not exactly a dead silence, but enough so that the gentle crackling of a fire from the kitchen behind resounded clearly. A spoon lightly tapped a plate somewhere, yet the usual lively chatter had dissolved into nothingness. Everyone watched him, waiting for his reaction. J.D. studied Clara more intently. She did not appear hostile, merely resolute. as though she had already made this decision, or someone had predetermined it for her. He glanced at her briefly, then toward the kitchen window where two chefs stood silently, their figures blurred under the soft glow of the lights, their faces revealing no emotion. In a calm, measured tone, he asked, "Did I do something to bring this on?" This time Clara did not falter. "It's just that we don't want you here tonight," she replied, her voice still polite but leaving no room for negotiation. "It's not a policy, nor is it because we're about to close. That's all." He had encountered his share of prickly situations, from heated debates to trap-laden interviews, but to be flatly refused at such an unassuming diner was strangely disconcerting, evoking an indescribable feeling. A soft cough interrupted his thoughts. J.D. turned his head, meeting the gaze of an elderly man seated near the counter, Mr. Walter, wearing a worn, faded coat with rugged hands etched by time. The old man shook his head slightly, as if pondering something internally, and then silently resumed spearing his food. A few steps away, Mrs. Ellen subtly shifted in her chair, her expression calm yet inscrutable. Across from her, a young man, perhaps Liam, around 30, leaned back, his arms crossed, his eyes glinting as if he were waiting to see how this drama would unfold. J.D. silently took note of everything, the sidelong glances that avoided meeting his eyes, the lingering looks filled with unspoken meaning, and even the piercing, cold flashes as though they were secretly the predicament. J.D. Vance felt the weight of the moment, like an evening breeze in Fairhope, Alabama, carrying a hint of moisture and a silence laden with foreboding. He had many paths to choose from. He could quietly step outside, shake his head, and let the matter drift into oblivion. He could ask for a clear explanation, gently inquiring if they had considered that this issue might make headlines tomorrow. Or he could confront the matter head-on, questioning whether they would stand by their decision upon realizing they were refusing a U.S. senator. But J.D. chose none of those paths. "All right," he said, his voice deep and steady, accompanied by a slow nod as if in contemplation. "Might I have a word with the manager?" That gentle question caused a few people in the diner to pause, as though they had just heard something unexpected. Clara, the server, hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the kitchen as if silently seeking someone's agreement. Mr. Walter, the elderly man seated at the counter with hands calloused from a lifetime of labor, murmured something under his breath, his voice so soft that only he could hear it. Liam, near the window and exuding confidence with his arms crossed, let out a short, derisive laugh, as if unable to believe that J.D. truly intended to push the conversation any further. J.D. remained standing there, patiently waiting, his demeanor calm and unruffled. Clara silently withdrew once more, this time through another wooden door, its surface faded by time. The space fell into a few beats of silence. The sound of lips clicking on a coffee cup echoed forlornly. A plate slid lightly across the counter, its dry sound cutting through the stillness. Then the door burst open, and a man of about 50 stepped out, his posture assured, with two strong arms folded before an apron already stained with grease. A name tag on him read Travis. Travis did not waste time asking J.D. what he wanted. He simply observed him silently from head to toe before speaking up. "I hear you have something to ask." But the way he said it carried no friendliness, nor did it retain the usual courteous tone. It was an invitation laced with challenge. J.D. Vance stared straight into Travis's eyes, his gaze calm and inscrutable, without a hint of wavering. He had not come here to argue or to flaunt power. But he was not the sort to simply turn his back without understanding why. "Yes," J.D. replied, his tone firm yet polite. "I want to understand why you won't serve me tonight." Travis exhaled sharply through his nose, a heavy sigh as though he had anticipated the question but was not particularly eager to answer. He raised a hand to lightly wipe his apron, his eyes glancing over the few patrons still intently watching. Some lowered their eyes as if indifferent, but the curious stares were impossible to hide. "Listen," Travis said in a lowered voice, leaning slightly as if to emphasize, "this isn't aimed personally at you." J.D. raised an eyebrow, a subtle gesture that betrayed his suspicion. "I'm afraid it seems rather personal, don't you think?" Travis's face tensed slightly. He rubbed his neck and let out a soft sigh. "The people around here have their own opinions about you, about what you represent. I have to look after this place, and I don't want to get entangled in any trouble." J.D. nodded slowly, letting Travis's words sink in like drops seeping into parched soil. "So, my sitting here, ordering a simple meal is trouble then?" Travis did not reply immediately. He glanced toward the counter where Mr. Walter remained silently with his plate of food, though his hands now moved more slowly, as if lost in thought. A few steps away, Liam still crossed his arms, his eyes glinting as if savoring a play. JD had encountered similar situations before, not exactly the same, but close enough to recognize. This was not merely a simple refusal. It carried a deeper meaning about how people perceived him, about the reactions that might cascade from it. It was the silent pressure from all sides, something that could force someone to make a decision they weren't entirely willing to make. He looked back at Travis, his voice gentle yet laden with significance. "Be honest with me, do you really think so? Or are you just trying to keep everything peaceful?" Travis paused briefly, his finger tapping lightly on his apron. And for the first time, JD noticed a hint of uncertainty on his face, as if his hard exterior had just revealed a small crack. But before he could answer, Liam interjected with a sharp tone and a sneering smile. "Oh, come on, don't make a fuss. You're simply not welcome here, that's it, no need to beat around the bush." JD turned his gaze toward him, studying him for a moment. Liam appeared to be the type who enjoyed stirring things up, always waiting for an excuse to jump into an argument. JD did not allow himself to be swept away. He turned back to Travis, his tone still even. "If you truly want me to leave, I will. But I want to hear your reasons clearly." His words hung in the air like an invitation for Travis to pause, to reconsider, or at least to face the decision squarely. Travis looked toward the kitchen, his eyes showing a trace of tension, then returned his gaze to JD. "I just don't want things to get any more complicated," he said, his voice lowering as if in reluctant admission. JD nodded slightly. "I feel the same." A long silence ensued. JD could have left then, quietly stepping out without a backward glance. He could have pulled out his phone, turning Maggie's haven into the center of attention online in just a few minutes. But instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair, sat down gently, and said, "Then let's talk." The atmosphere in the diner grew taut. JD did nothing loud, no table slamming or shouting. He simply sat there, his hands resting on the table, exuding a calm air as if time itself were of no concern. Maggie's haven had never witnessed anything like this. Confrontations typically ended quickly, either someone left or both parties fell silent. But this time was different. Travis looked at him for a long while, then exhaled as if releasing a burden. "Talk?" he repeated, his voice tinged with surprise, as if suddenly disoriented by his own presence here. JD shrugged lightly. "You don't want me here, I understand. But I need to know why. So, explain it to me." Liam let out a short, mocking laugh from the corner of the diner. Good grief, this guy really has some guts. JD paid him no mind. Travis pulled a chair to face JD. But he did not sit down. Instead, he leaned against the back of the chair, his hands resting lightly on it, his apron still bearing a trace of flour from the morning. "I have to run this place," Travis said in a deep, steady voice. "I don't like causing trouble. I don't want our diner making the papers. But I have to think of the people here." JD nodded. "I understand. So tell me, what do the people here think of me?" Travis glanced around as if waiting for someone else to speak on his behalf. Clara stood behind the counter, twirling a tray with a restless air. Mr. Walter kept his head bowed, but the spoon in his hand had long since ceased moving. Then Travis turned back to JD. "The people around here aren't very fond of politicians. They don't trust them much. And some of the things you've said, some of the positions you support, it doesn't sit well with them." JD leaned back slightly, tilting his head. "I understand. And that, I suppose, is rather fair. But you don't really know me, do you?" JD Vance asked, his voice deep and gentle, like a breeze drifting through the shady oaks in Fairhope, Alabama. Travis paused, his eyes betraying a hint of hesitation. "No, not exactly in the sense of knowing you directly," he replied, his tone low as if weighing every word. "Then give me a straight answer," JD continued, his eyes bright and resolute. "If I were just an ordinary man walking in here, not the face that's appeared on TV, would we be sitting and talking like this?" A silence fell over Maggie's haven, so profound that even the sound of wind whistling through the door cracks became distinct. JD let the quiet linger, watching Travis's face no dramatic change, but as if a small crack had silently appeared. Then, from a corner of the diner, Liam broke the air with a mocking laugh. "This isn't about TV, my friend," he said, his tone sharp as to cut in. "Everyone knows exactly who you are." JD turned, his calm gaze meeting Liam's. "Then who am I in your eyes?" he asked, his voice still even yet carrying a touch of mild defiance. Liam grinned broadly, as though finally granted the chance to shine. "You're the guy who always acts like he understands ordinary people, yet ends up maneuvering through political games like all the other slick talking suits." JD nodded slowly, as if savoring every word Liam had just said. "I understand," he replied, his tone soft yet incisive. "So what do you think I should do differently?" Liam blinked, clearly not expecting such a gentle response from JD. "You want me to just brush you off?" JD pressed on, his voice even but now imbued with a hint of intonation. "I'm ready to leave, but before that, tell me everything you want to say. The floor is yours." The diner fell deathly silent, even the sizzling of oil in the kitchen ceased. Not a sound emerged from plates, forks, or the usual calls for orders. Travis sighed, rubbing his neck with a weary gesture. "I didn't think tonight would turn out this way," he said, his voice deep like a reluctant confession. JD offered a slight, exhausted but sincere smile. "Neither did I." And for the first time, the tension in the space was not merely a divide, it was something deeper, closer to understanding. The diner was no longer just quiet. It was as if it were holding its breath. Those who had pretended not to care now furtively glanced at the edges of their plates, their eyes gleaming with discreet curiosity. JD sat there, patient like a diner awaiting his favorite meal. Liam, still leaning against his chair, seemed poised to launch another barb, but for the first time, a momentary hesitation flickered across his face. Perhaps he realized that JD was not resisting or defending himself, he was simply waiting silently. Travis, his hand still clutched to the back of his chair, finally exhaled a long breath. "Do you really want to know what they think of you?" he asked, shaking his head as if the question were too obvious. "They say you speak in pretty words, but it's all empty chatter." JD didn't react strongly, he just tilted his head slightly, as if inviting him to continue. "They say you talk a lot about the working class, but in the end, you're just another player in that old political game. You promise all sorts of things, like the other slick-suited guys, but nothing ever changes." Travis exhaled sharply through his nose, his voice dropping even lower. "And they don't forget, either." JD nodded slowly, his eyes sincere. "I understand that," he said softly, as though sharing a secret. Liam snorted dismissively. "Is that all?" JD turned to him, his eyes clear yet without confrontation. "What more do you want me to say?" Liam straightened up, his voice rising as if provoked. "I don't know, man. You have to fight back, defend yourself, do something." JD rested his forearms on the table, his gesture calm yet weighted. "You already had your conclusion about me before, didn't you? Right before I stepped through that door, you wanted me to lose it, to get into a fist fight, so you could prove you were right." Liam's mouth opened, but no words emerged. JD continued, his tone even yet warm. "But what if I said that I understand that feeling of disappointment all the way down to my bones? What then?" He looked back at Travis. "You said nothing would change. I know. I grew up in that scene, watching people left behind, and I, too, once felt forgotten. But then I went to school, did things no one thought I could do. That doesn't mean I've forgotten." Travis's finger tapped lightly on the back of his chair. His face was inscrutable, yet free of any scorn. He looked as though he were deep in thought, his eyes reflective. JD scanned the diner with a serene gaze that embraced the space. "I don't expect any of you to agree with me. I came here not to change anyone's mind. I only walked in as a diner, wanting nothing more than to enjoy a simple dinner." A pause passed. Then from behind the counter, Mr. Walter, in his faded old coat, murmured, It's a pity when a man can't even secure a decent meal. The tension in the air eased slightly. A few people chuckled softly. Even Travis let out a small laugh, shaking his head as if caught up in the moment. JD turned back to him, his voice gentle yet full of meaning. "So what do we do now?" Travis exhaled, rubbing his face, his eyes flicking toward the kitchen where the chef still watched, then returning to JD. "Let me put it this way," he replied in a deep but clear tone. "You sit here, and we'll finish this conversation. And if, after that, I find you're not just a smooth talker, then maybe I'll have Clara bring you the menu." JD nodded, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Sounds like a fair invitation." For the first time that evening, the heaviness of division in the room lifted. It felt like a new beginning. Closer to a real conversation now. The stiffness on Travis's shoulders softened a little. Liam, sitting in the corner, no longer smirking, now sat more upright as if this drama was no longer a joke. Even those customers who had silently observed from afar seemed less certain of their prejudices. JD leaned forward slightly, his voice calm yet compelling. "Then that's good," he said. "Let's finish this conversation." Travis exhaled and sat down in the chair opposite him, his demeanor weary, not the weariness of a long day's work, but the deep exhaustion of a man burdened for years, as if his voice had ceased to matter. "I'll be frank," Travis said, rubbing his hands together. "I'm not sure you're really the man people think you are. I don't know if you truly care about us or if you're just good at saying pleasant things." JD nodded gently. "I understand, and that's very fair." Travis studied him more intently. "But I do know one thing: the people here have a very good memory. They remember every promise made to them. They remember every time someone shakes their hand, looks them in the eye, promises to do something, and then turns their back and never comes back." JD lightly tapped his knuckles on the table, contemplating for a moment, then replied, "I don't blame them for that." Travis gave a dry laugh, shaking his head. "The point is, no one blames anyone." A silence settled once more. Then from behind the counter, Mr. Walter spoke again, his voice low. "I worked in the factory for 35 years minus 35 long years." He set his coffee cup down with a soft clink. "I watched neighbors lose their jobs, saw entire families pack up and leave, because there's nothing left for them to stay for. Politicians show up, shake a few hands, say they understand us, and then drive off to some damned place that no one cares about." Mr. Walter looked up, his voice low and carrying the weight of a lifetime's experience in Fairhope, Alabama. JD Vance stared straight into his eyes, his gaze sincere yet magnetic. "So you think I'm just like them?" he asked, his voice gentle yet enough to make the entire Maggie's haven seem to sag. Mr. Walter looked at him for a long moment, his eyes, clouded by time, glimmering softly under the gentle yellow lights. Then he shrugged, his movement slow as if in contemplation. "I'm not sure," he said, "but I know one thing." He raised his calloused finger in JD's direction, his voice firm. "You're the first person who stayed to listen." Clara, the server behind the counter, turned slightly, her eyes flicking toward Travis with a hint of perplexity. The two chefs in the kitchen, their figures blurred behind a haze of smoke, exchanged a look that was hard to decipher. Even Liam, the man who had once boldly criticized, was now suddenly silent, his eyes avoiding direct contact as if unsure how to react. JD let the silence settle, like an evening breeze slipping through those old wooden frames. He turned to Travis, his voice calm yet full of meaning. "So what do we do now?" Travis tapped his finger lightly on the table, his eyes drifting toward the kitchen, then exhaled a long breath as if releasing a heavy burden. He stood up, his voice deep yet clear. "Clara, bring him the menu." A ripple of quiet astonishment passed through the diner. Liam snorted, but he didn't open his mouth to object. Clara hesitated only for an instant before retrieving the plastic-wrapped menu and stepping forward to hand it to JD with a slight nod. "Thank you," JD said, accompanied by a polite nod. Travis shook his head, half joking, half serious. "I still don't know whether to like you or not." JD smiled, flipping open the menu, his voice gentle. "That's fine. I don't need everyone to like me." Travis let out a short laugh, then turned back toward the kitchen. "Now, you all fire up the grill." And just like that, What began as a cold refusal turned into a story that no one in this small diner would ever forget. The tension gradually dissipated, not completely, but enough for the clink of a fork against a plate to be heard once again, enough for the murmurs of conversation to trickle through the space like a small stream. JD sat on the long chair, menu in hand, yet his eyes weren't fixed on it. He observed Travis, watched Mr. Walter at the counter, then glanced over at Liam, who still bore a hint of suspicion, though the smirk had vanished. Clara came over and poured a cup of robust black coffee without a word. JD nodded his thanks. She hesitated for a moment, then softly said, "The coffee here is strong, so be careful." JD took a sip, raising his eyebrows with a look of pleasure. "I can feel it," he replied. A few people chuckled softly, not loudly, but enough to ease the atmosphere. Travis still stood near the kitchen, his arms folded, watching JD as if trying to read him through every subtle gesture. Finally, Travis sighed and stepped closer, pulling out a chair to sit down once again. "All right then," he said, his voice warm and deep. "Since you're here, tell me something." JD set the menu down on the table, his eyes curious. "What do you mean?" Travis tilted his head, his tone carrying a note of seriousness. "Have you ever been in this situation before?" JD pondered for a moment. It wasn't just about being refused, because that was a familiar part of the job, where someone could adore him one day and turn their back the next. But the feeling of being bluntly told you're not welcome in a humble place like this with such weight behind it was something new. "No," JD admitted, his voice sincere, "not quite like this." Travis nodded slowly, as if that confirmed a silent thought within him. "And yet, you stayed." JD leaned back, took another sip of coffee, his tone even. "Yeah, that's right." Travis let out a small laugh, his eyes showing a trace of surprise. "Most guys like you would have left long ago, maybe caused a scene, called a lawyer, or turned this place into tomorrow's breaking news." JD smirked, a playful glint in his eyes. "I did think about that." Travis laughed louder, shaking his head in disbelief, then grew serious. "You can't change people's minds," he said, his voice low. JD nodded softly. "I know that." Travis exhaled, rubbing his neck as if lost in thought. "I can't be sure that tomorrow no one will regret having served you," he continued. JD beamed warmly, his voice gentle. "That's only fair." Mr. Walter at the counter spoke up again, his eyes still fixed on his coffee cup. "It's a pity when a man can't even secure a decent meal." JD turned to him, his tone warm. "I think that's about to change." Clara appeared immediately afterward, placing a plate of food before him, a classic cheeseburger, accompanied by hand-cut fries, simple yet appealing. JD picked up the burger and took a bite. Silence fell. Then he said, his face serious, "Maybe it needs a bit more sauce." The diner fell silent for half a second. Travis burst into hearty laughter, the first unrestrained laugh of the night. A few others joined in with chuckles, while Clara shook her head with reluctant amusement. JD set the burger down, wiped his hands on a napkin, and smiled, "Just kidding, it's delicious." Travis merely shook his head, still laughing. "You're truly a mystery." JD nodded lightly. "I've heard that one plenty of times." Liam in the corner said nothing, but his eyes now looked different, perhaps not entirely convinced, but no longer dismissively brushing everything off as before. When JD finished his meal, Maggie's haven truly came back to life as a diner. The lively chatter gradually returned, plates clattered, and coffee was poured into cups once more. People still held their own opinions, still doubted, but on that evening in this small town, a different kind of conversation had taken place, and perhaps that was enough. For in an era where everyone is ready to shout, sometimes the strength lies in staying, listening, and proving, even if only for a moment, that not everything has to turn into a battle. If you've read this far, I have a small question for you. Have you ever found yourself standing on the edge, choosing whether to walk away or stay to listen? If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. We'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends, helping us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.